Have you ever stopped to think about how many times your mother told you that everything was fine, that you were safe, that nothing bad could happen to you as long as she was around? Those words that make us sleep peacefully at night, that make us believe that the world outside might be dangerous, but inside our home we are protected. I believe that for years, every word that came out of her mouth was like a sacred promise, an invisible shield against all the evils of the world. But what if I told you that the same person who swore to protect you, who rocked you to sleep, who dried your tears and told you that monsters don't exist, was exactly the one who handed you over to them? Can you imagine what it's like to look into the eyes of the person who gave you life and realize that something is wrong, terribly wrong? To feel that chill down your spine when you realize that the protective embrace has become a trap, that the walls of your home are no longer a refuge but a prison, waiting to close in. I was 13 years old when my mother looked at me across our small kitchen table in our Moscow apartment and said those words that still echo in my mind like a death sentence. She said I needed to trust her, that some men would be coming to talk to me, that it was for my own good, for our family's safety, and like the naive child I nodded, because mothers don't lie to their children, do they? Mothers don't betray the ones they brought into this world, or so I thought, until I heard the heavy knock on the door that afternoon. 3 solid knocks that seemed to shake the entire building. And when I looked at my mother's face, I saw something I had never seen before. Was it fear? Was it guilt? Was it resignation? I couldn't tell, but what I knew for certain was that whatever was about to happen would change everything forever. The door opened and 2 men in dark coats stepped inside. They didn't need to show identification, because everyone in the Soviet Union knew who they were. You could smell the KGB before you even saw their faces. It was in the way they moved, the way they looked at you like you were already guilty of crimes you didn't even know existed. And when my mother stepped aside, when she actually moved out of their way and gestured toward me with a trembling hand, that's when I understood that the greatest betrayal doesn't come from strangers or enemies. It comes from the person who taught you what love means. Now you might be wondering what could possibly make a mother do such a thing. What kind of circumstances could break that sacred bond between parent and child? Was she forced? Was she threatened? Was there something darker at play that I couldn't see as a 13-year-old boy standing in that kitchen watching his entire world collapse? These are questions that haunted me for decades. Questions that I'm finally ready to answer, because the truth is far more complex and far more terrifying than you could ever imagine. And if you think you know how the story ends, if you think you can predict what happened next, I promise you that what I'm about to tell you will shake everything you believe about loyalty, family, and survival in one of the darkest periods of human history. So stay with me, because by the end of this story, you'll understand that sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who can hurt us in ways we never thought possible. And you'll learn what it truly means to survive when the person who was supposed to save you becomes the reason you need saving. The knock on the door wasn't like any knock I had ever heard before. It was deliberate, calculated, the kind of sound that announces authority before anyone even speaks. And in that frozen moment between the second and third knock, I watched my mother's hand shake as she smoothed down her dress. A nervous gesture I had seen her do 1,000 times, but never quite like this. Never with this particular terror dancing in her eyes. She walked to the door, moving like someone in a dream, or maybe a nightmare. Her steps were slow and measured, as if each one brought her closer to something irreversible. And when her hand touched the doorknob, I remember thinking, please don't open it. Please just leave it closed and maybe they'll go away. Maybe this is all a mistake. Maybe we can pretend we're not home. But of course, that's not how it works in Moscow in 1982. You don't ignore the KGB. You don't pretend you're not home when they come calling. Because they already know you're there. They always know. The door swung open and the temperature in our small apartment seemed to drop 10 degrees instantly. 2 men stood in the doorway, and they looked exactly like you would imagine Soviet secret police to look. Dark wool coats that hung past their knees, faces that showed no emotion whatsoever, as if they had trained themselves to forget what it meant to be human. The taller one had eyes that were almost colorless, like ice on a frozen lake. And when those eyes found me across the room, I felt something inside my chest tighten and twist. The shorter one carried a leather briefcase, and he was the first to speak. His voice was flat and bureaucratic as he said my mother's full name followed by my own. Not a question, but a statement, confirming what they already knew. And my mother just nodded. She didn't ask who they were or what they wanted. She didn't demand to see identification or threaten to call the police, because what would be the point? These men were the law. They were judge, and jury and executioner all rolled into one dark coat. And then something happened that I will never forget as long as I live. My mother turned to look at me, and for just a split second, I saw her face contort with something that might have been anguish or might have been apology, but then it was gone, replaced by a mask of forced calm. And she said in Russian, "This is my son. He's ready for what I wanted to scream, ready for what?" But the word stuck in my throat like broken glass. The tall man with the ice eyes stepped into our apartment without being invited. His boots left wet marks on our floor from the melting snow outside, and he looked around our small living space with a kind of disdain that made it clear he had been in 1,000 apartments just like this one. Poor, cramped, filled with people whose lives meant nothing to the state machine. My mother gestured for me to come closer, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to bolt for the back window, to hide under my bed like I did when I was little, and thought that monsters couldn't find you if you stayed very still. But I was 13, and I had been raised to obey, to follow orders, to trust that adults, especially my mother, knew what was best. So I walked toward them on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. Each step was an eternity, and I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, so loud I was sure everyone in the room could hear it too. When I reached my mother's side, she put her hand on my shoulder, and I remember thinking that her hand felt cold, colder than it should have been, and she squeezed my shoulder once, twice, 3 times. Was it meant to be reassuring, or was it goodbye? The shorter man with the briefcase opened it with a sharp click that echoed in our silent apartment, and he pulled out some papers, official-looking documents with red stamps and Cyrillic text that I couldn't read from where I stood. He showed them to my mother, who barely glanced at them before nodding again, that same defeated nod that told me she had already agreed to whatever this was long before these men showed up at our door. And that's when the real horror started to sink in. This was a surprise visit. This wasn't random. My mother had known they were coming. She had expected them, maybe even arranged this meeting herself. The tall man finally spoke, and his voice was like gravel, low and rough. He said my name, and told me I would need to come with him for questioning about what I asked, and my voice sounded so small and childish that I barely recognized it. But he didn't answer me. Instead, he looked at my mother as if I hadn't spoken at all, as if I was just an object to be moved from one place to another, and my mother, my own mother, who had sung me lullabies and made me soup when I was sick and promised that she would always, always protect me. She looked at the stranger and said he'll cooperate. He knows it's important, but I didn't know it was important. I didn't know anything. I didn't even know what I was supposed to have done wrong. And when I turned to her with panic rising in my throat like bile and asked her what's happening, why are they here? Please tell me what's going on. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She looked at the floor or the wall or anywhere but at my face. And that's when I knew with absolute certainty that whatever was about to happen, my mother wasn't going to stop it. She wasn't going to fight for me. She wasn't going to throw herself between me and these men and demand they leave her son alone. She was going to let them take me. No, worse than that. She was helping them take me. The shorter man put the papers back in his briefcase and pulled out something else, a photograph. He held up so I could see it and asked me if I recognized the people in it. I squinted at the faded image and felt my stomach drop, because yes, I recognized them. They were my uncle's friends, men who sometimes visited our apartment late at night when they thought I was asleep, men who spoke in hushed voices about things I didn't understand, about freedom and change and the way things should be, and suddenly, pieces started falling into place like a puzzle made of razor blades. My mother had been listening to those conversations. She had been reporting them. And now they wanted me to do the same. They wanted to inform on my own family, on the people I loved, and my mother was handing me over to make sure I learned how. The tall man reached out and grabbed my arm, not roughly but firmly enough that I knew I couldn't pull away. And as he guided me toward the door, I looked back at my mother one last time, hoping to see remorse or love or anything that resembled the woman I thought I knew. But her face was blank, empty, a stranger's face. And the last thing I heard before they let me out into the cold Moscow evening was her voice saying, "Be good. Listen to what they tell you, and I'll see you soon." But even then I knew that the person who eventually came back to that apartment wouldn't be the same boy who left, and the mother who said she'd see me soon had no idea that she had just killed something in me that could never be brought back to life. And as we descended the stairs of our building into the waiting black car on the street, I realized that safety was just a lie parents tell their children to help them sleep, and that sometimes the person you need protection from is the one who promised to keep you safe. The moment we stepped outside into the bitter Moscow cold, I felt my mother's hand on my back, not pulling me away from these men, but pushing me toward them, a gentle, firm push that said, "Go with them. Don't resist. This is how it has to be." And that touch burned worse than any slap ever could because it carried the weight of deliberate choice. She was choosing this, choosing them over me. I turned my head one last time, hoping desperately that I would see her face crumble, that I would see her break down and change her mind and scream, "Wait, stop. You can't take my son." But instead she stood in the doorway of our apartment building with her arms wrapped around herself against the cold, watching, just watching as they guided me toward a black Volga parked at the curb. Its engine already running, exhaust rising like ghost breath in the frozen air. The tall man opened the back door and placed his hand on top of my head, pushing me down into the seat, a gesture I had seen in movies but never imagined would happen to me. And as I slid across the cold leather interior, I could smell cigarettes and something else, something like fear that had soaked into the upholstery from all the other people who had sat where I was sitting now, wondering if they would ever see their homes again. The shorter man climbed in beside me, trapping me between him and the door, while the tall one took the front passenger seat. The driver, a third man I hadn't noticed before, didn't even glance back at me. He just put the car in gear and we started moving. And through the rear window, I watched my mother. She was still standing there in the doorway, growing smaller and smaller as we drove away. And she didn't wave. She didn't cry. She just stood there like a statue until we turned the corner. And she disappeared from view forever and away because the woman I had known as my mother ceased to exist in that moment. I wanted to ask where we were going, but my throat had closed up. Every breath felt like I was swallowing stones. My hands were shaking so badly that I had to clasp them together in my lap. And the shorter man noticed. He glanced down at my trembling hands and said in a voice that was almost kind, almost gentle, "Don't be frightened. We just need to talk to you. Your mother understands this. She knows it's necessary." And hearing him say her title, mother, as if she deserved that word, as if she had earned the right to be called that after what she had just done, made something crack inside my chest. I wanted to scream at him that she wasn't my mother anymore, that real mothers don't do this. But I was 13 and terrified, and so I said nothing. I just stared at my hands and tried not to cry because even then I knew that showing weakness to these men would be a mistake. We drove for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, through streets I recognized and then streets I didn't, past buildings that grew larger and more imposing, past checkpoints, where guards waved us through without question because they knew this car, they knew what it meant. And finally we pulled up to a gray stone building that looked like it wanted to swallow the sky. There were no signs, no indicators of what this place was, but everyone in Moscow knew buildings like this, official buildings, secret buildings, places where people went in and didn't always come out. The car stopped and the tall man opened his door, then mine, and once again his hand was on my arm, guiding me out onto the sidewalk. My legs almost gave out when I stood up. They felt like water, and for a horrible second I thought I might collapse right there on the street, but somehow I stayed upright. Somehow I put one foot in front of the other as they led me toward a heavy wooden door that opened before we even reached it. Inside the building was exactly what you expect: sterile, cold, fluorescent lights that made everyone look sick and pale, linoleum floors that squeaked under, our shoes, walls painted a depressing shade of institutional green. We walked down a corridor past closed doors behind which I could hear voices, muffled sound that might have been conversation or might have been something worse. The shorter man stayed close beside me while the tall one walked ahead, and I noticed that the shorter one kept his hand near my elbow, not touching me but ready to grab me if I tried to run, as if there was anywhere to run to in this labyrinth. We climbed a staircase to the third floor and then walked down another corridor until we reached a door marked only with a number 347. The tall man knocked twice and a voice from inside said, "Enter," and that's when we went into the room where everything would change. It was a small office, barely bigger than my bedroom at home, with a desk, 3 chairs, and a single window that had been painted over so you couldn't see outside. Behind the desk sat a man who was older than the two who had brought me here, maybe 50 or 60, with gray hair and glasses and the kind of face that had forgotten how to smile decades ago. He gestured to one of the chairs in front of his desk and said, "Sit," not to the men but to me. And I sat because what else could I do? The tall and short man positioned themselves on either side of the door like guards or like barriers preventing any escape, and the man behind the desk opened a file folder that had been sitting on his desk. A thick folder filled with papers and what looked like photographs. He studied the contents for a long moment, making me wait, making me squirm, and then he looked up at me with eyes that were neither kind nor cruel, but simply empty, and he said, "Your mother is a patriot. She loves her country. She understands that sometimes we must make difficult choices to protect the motherland." And I felt my stomach twist because I knew it was coming. I knew what he was going to say before he said it. "Your mother came to us 3 weeks ago," he continued. "She told us about your uncle and his friends, about the things they say, the plans they make, the dangerous ideas they spread. She did this because she knows that such people are enemies of the state, threats to everything we have built, and she has agreed to help us stop them." And I sat there feeling like I was falling, like the chair beneath me had disappeared, and I was plummeting through space. 3 weeks. She had been planning this for 3 weeks, which meant every time she looked at me in those weeks, every time she asked about my day or made my dinner or kissed me goodnight, she was already preparing to hand me over. And then he said the words that made my blood turn to ice. "And now you will help us too. You will tell us everything you know about your uncle's activities, everyone who visits him, everything you've heard them say. And if you cooperate, if you prove yourself loyal to your country like your mother has, then everything will be fine. You'll go home. You'll continue your life. But if you refuse," he paused and let the threat hang in the air unfinished. And I looked at this man and then at the guards by the door, and I realized that I had no power here, no choices, no way out. I was 13 years old, and the state had decided I would become an informant, a spy against my own family, and my mother had delivered me to them gift-wrapped. And the most horrifying part was that somewhere in her mind she probably believed she was doing the right thing, that she was protecting me, or protecting herself, or protecting some abstract idea of the Soviet Union that mattered more than her own child. The man behind the desk pushed a piece of paper across to me. It was a statement, already typed up, confessing that I had witnessed anti-Soviet activities and agreeing to provide information to the authorities. All it needed was my signature, and he held out a pen and said, "Sign it." And I looked at that pen like it was a weapon, because that's exactly what it was, a weapon they would use to destroy my uncle, to destroy his friends, maybe to destroy my whole family. And my hand reached out. I watched it move as if it belonged to someone else. And I took the pen because I was a child and I was scared and I didn't know what else to do. And in that moment, I understood with perfect clarity that my mother hadn't just handed me over to KGB. She had handed over my soul, my innocence, my ability to trust anyone ever again. She had taken the boy I was and transformed him into something else, something broken and compromised and stained. And as the pen touched the paper, I heard her voice in my head saying, "I love you. Be safe." Those lies she had told me my entire life. And I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the pen at the wall and tell them all to go to hell. But instead I signed my name in shaky letters that didn't even look like my handwriting. And the man behind the desk smiled for the first time, a thin, cruel smile, and said, "Good boy, your mother will be so proud." And those words, those terrible words, made me realize that this wasn't just betrayal. This was something worse. This was a mother who had not only abandoned her child, but had actively participated in his destruction, who had smoothed the path for corruption, who had chosen to stay over her own blood. And as they finally led me out of that room, back down the corridors, back into the cold Moscow night, I knew that even if I did eventually go home, even if I did see my mother again, I would never be able to look at her the same way, never be able to hear her say she loved me without remembering this day, this room, this moment when she proved that her love had conditions and limits and that I'd fallen outside of them. And the worst part, the part that still haunts me all these decades later, is that I never got the chance to ask her why. Why did you do it? What could possibly have been worth this? Was it fear or ideology or self-preservation or something else entirely? Because they took me to a different apartment that night, not home, but to a safe house where they could watch me and train me and make sure I understood my new role. And by the time I finally saw my mother again weeks later, I was already changed, already broken, already lost. And the question why seemed pointless, because no answer could ever be enough. No explanation could ever justify what she had done. And so I never asked. I just looked at her across our kitchen table, the same table where this nightmare had begun, and I saw a stranger, a collaborator, a woman who had chosen survival over love. And I understood that the KGB hadn't just recruited one informant that day. They had created one and destroyed another. They had taken a mother and a son and turned them both into something unrecognizable. And that was a real handover. Not just my body walking out that door, but my entire existence being transferred from the warm hands of childhood innocence into the cold mechanical grip of a system that devoured its own children and called it patriotism. The safe house was nothing like home. It was a cramped apartment on the outskirts of Moscow that smelled of mildew and old cabbage, with furniture that looked like it had been stolen from a dozen different places and thrown together, without any thought for comfort or style. There was a narrow bed with thin mattress that sagged in the middle, a small table with 2 chairs, and a window that looked out onto a concrete courtyard where nothing grew and no one played. This is where you'll stay for. Now, the tall man said as he pushed me gently into the room, someone will bring you food. Someone will come and talk to you. Do not try to leave. Do not try to contact anyone. If you cooperate, this will all be over soon. And then he closed the door, and I heard the lock click from the outside. I was a prisoner, not in a jail cell with bars, but in this depressing little room that was somehow worse because it pretended to be normal, pretended to be just a place to stay, when really it was a cage, designed to break me down piece by piece. I sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed myself to cry, not the loud sobbing of a child, but the silent, desperate tears of someone who has just realized that the world is not what they thought it was, that the people you trust can become your enemies, that safety is an illusion and love is conditional. I cried until there were no more tears left, and then I just sat there in the gathering darkness because no one had shown me where the light switch was, or maybe there wasn't one, and I tried to understand what had just happened, tried to piece together the logic of it. My mother had gone to the KGB 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks, which meant she had made this decision long before those men showed up at our door. She had walked into some official building somewhere and told them about my uncle, about his friends, about their late-night conversations that I had only half heard and barely understood. And why? What could have motivated her to do something so unthinkable? Was she afraid? Had they threatened her? Had they promised her something in return? Or did she genuinely believe that what she was doing was right, that turning in her own brother was an act of patriotism rather than betrayal? I thought back over those 3 weeks trying to remember if there had been any signs, any clues that she was planning this, and I realized with a sickening clarity that yes, there had been signs everywhere, the way she had started asking me. Questions about my uncle, casual questions that seemed innocent at the time. What do you and Uncle Mikhail talk about when I'm not around? Who are those men who visit him? What do they discuss? And I had answered her honestly, because she was my mother, and you tell your mother things. You don't suspect her of gathering intelligence, of building a case against her own family. I remember how she had seemed nervous lately, jumpy, how she would flinch at unexpected noises, how she had stopped. Sleeping well, I could hear her pacing in the kitchen late at night, and I had thought she was worried about money or work or some adult problem that had nothing to do with me. But now I understood that she had been wrestling with her conscience, if she even had one anymore, deciding whether to go through this terrible plan. And ultimately she had decided that yes, it was worth it, whatever it was she hoped to gain, or avoid was worth sacrificing her son. The first interrogation came the next morning. I hadn't slept, just laid on that sagging mattress staring at the ceiling, listening to the buildings settle and creak around me. And when the door opened, I actually felt relieved because at least something was happening. At least I wasn't alone with my thoughts anymore. It was a different man this time, younger, maybe 30, with a friendly face that was probably designed to put children at ease. He introduced himself as Dmitri and said he was here to help me understand my situation, help me do the right thing. He sat down at the small table and gestured for me to join him, and when I did, he pulled out a notebook and a pen and said, "Let's start at the beginning. Tell me about your uncle." And for a moment, I considered refusing, considered telling him I wouldn't say anything, wouldn't betray my family the way my mother had betrayed me. But then I remembered the man behind the desk and his empty eyes and his casual threats. And I remembered that I was 13, years old and locked in a room and completely powerless. So I started talking. I told him about Uncle Mikhail, who was my mother's younger brother, about how he was a teacher at the university, about how he was smart and funny, and always had time for me when my mother was too busy. I told him about the friends who visited our apartment. Though I didn't know most of their names, I described them as best I could. The tall one with the beard, the woman with the red scarf, the man who always smoked. those terrible cigarettes that made my eyes water, and Dmitri wrote everything down in his notebook, nodding encouragingly, asking follow-up questions. What did they talk about? What did you hear them say? And I tried to remember, but honestly, most of their conversations had gone over my head. He used words I didn't understand, talked about philosophers and politicians and historical events that meant nothing to a 13-year-old boy. But Dmitri pressed me. Surely you remember something. Specific. Some name they mentioned, some plan they discussed, and I racked my brain trying to give him something because I was terrified of what would happen if I wasn't useful enough, if they decided I was worthless and disposed of me like garbage. So I told him about fragmented conversation, about how they had talked about Poland and solidarity, about how Uncle Mikhail had said that change was coming whether the old men in the Kremlin liked it or not, about how the woman with the red scarf had laughed and said we should be so lucky, and Dmitri's pen moved faster across the page, and I realized with growing horror that these small, meaningless fragments that I barely understood were being transformed into evidence, into proof of anti-Soviet activity, into ammunition that will be used to destroy people I care about. This went on for hours, Dmitri asking questions and me answering them, and by the end I felt like I had been turned inside out, like every memory had been extracted and examined and weaponized. And when he finally closed his notebook and stood up, he patted me on the shoulder and said, "You did well. You're a good boy. Your mother was right about you." And I wanted to ask her what exactly my mother had told him about me, what lies or truths she'd shared to convince him I would cooperate. But he left before I could find my voice, and I was alone again. The interrogations continued every day, sometimes with Dmitri, sometimes with other men, and once with A, woman who was somehow more frightening than all of them because she smiled while she asked her terrible questions. They brought me photographs and asked me to identify people. They played me recordings of conversations and asked me to confirm whose voices I heard. They showed me documents covered in Cyrillic text and asked me if I had seen my uncle with papers like these. And each time I cooperated because I was scared and alone, and I didn't know what else to do. But each time I felt something inside me dying, some essential part of what made me human, some capacity for trust and love and innocence that was being systematically destroyed. And the worst part was that I started to understand the logic of it, started to see why the Soviet system worked this way. Because once they had compromised you, once they had made you complicit in betrayal, you belonged to them forever. You could never go back to being the person you were before. You could never wash the stain off your hands. And they knew this, they counted on it. They were experts at breaking people and rebuilding them as loyal servants of the state. And I was just another child in a long line of children who had been sacrificed on the altar of ideology. After 2 weeks in the safe house, they told me I could go home. They said I had been very helpful, that they appreciated my cooperation, that I should continue my normal life, but remain alert, remain watchful, and if I heard anything else, I should contact them immediately. They gave me a phone number to memorize and made me repeat it back to them until they were satisfied I wouldn't forget it. And then, just like that, I was released, put in a car and driven back to my neighborhood and deposited on the corner near my building as if nothing had happened, as if I hadn't spent 2 weeks being transformed into an informant, into a spy, into a traitor. I walked up the stairs to our apartment slowly, each step heavier than the last, and when I opened the door, my mother was there in the kitchen cooking dinner. She looked up when I entered, and for just a second, I saw a relief flash across her face. Maybe even love. And she said, "There you are. I was worried. Are you hungry?" As if I had just been gone for a few hours instead of 2 weeks. As if she hadn't orchestrated my kidnapping and corruption. And I looked at this woman who had given birth to me and raised me, and I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no love, no sadness, just emptiness. Just a vast hollow space where my heart used to be. I nodded and said, "Yes, I'm hungry." And I sat down at the table, and she served me soup and bread, and we ate in silence. And neither of us acknowledged what happened. Neither of us spoke about the KGB or the interrogations or the fact that she had handed me over to them. We just pretended everything was normal, and I realized that this was how we would survive this, through pretense, through carefully maintained lies, through the fiction that we were still a mother and son rather than two collaborators trapped in the same apartment. And over the following weeks and months, I learned to live with what I had become. I went back to school and sat through classes and did my homework like any normal teenager. I saw my uncle occasionally and smiled at him and hugged him, and all the while I was watching him, listening to him, gathering information that I dutifully reported through that phone number they had given me. And every time I called that number and spoke in coded language about what I had heard or seen, I felt that emptiness inside me grow larger, felt myself becoming less human and more machine, and I wondered if my mother felt the same way, if she too had this vast hollow space inside her where love and conscience used to be, or she had found some way to justify what she had done, to tell herself that she was protecting me or protecting herself or serving some greater good. But I never asked her. We never talked about it. We lived together in that apartment like strangers who happened to share the same space, going through the motions of being a family, while both knowing it was all performance. And the saddest part was that I couldn't even hate her properly, couldn't muster the energy for rage or resentment because that would require caring. And I had learned that caring about anything or anyone was dangerous. That love made you vulnerable. That trust was a weapon people use against you. So I felt nothing. I became nothing, just a hollow boy going through the motions of living while waiting for something, anything, to fill the emptiness inside. And I understand now, looking back, that this was the real damage the KGB did. Not the interrogations or the fear or even the forced betrayal, but this transformation of human beings into empty vessels, into people who had learned that survival required the death of everything that made life worth living. And my mother had started this process. She had taken the first step by handing me over, by choosing the state over her son, by deciding that some abstract political loyalty was more important than the bond between parent and child. And in doing so, she hadn't just betrayed me. She had taught me that betrayal was normal, that love was conditional, that there was nothing in this world you could truly count on. And that lesson, that terrible lesson, was a gift she gave me that day when she stood in our doorway and watched them take me away. The truth started revealing itself in pieces, like a photograph slowly developing in a darkroom, each fragment more disturbing than the last. And it began 6 months after my first interrogation when I overheard a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. My mother was talking to someone on the telephone in our kitchen. She thought I was asleep, but I had gotten up to get water, and I stood in the hallway listening to her voice, low and urgent, speaking in a tone I had never heard her use before. She was saying, "Please, I did everything you asked. I gave you my son. What more do you want from me?" And there was a long pause while whoever was on the other end responded. And then she said, "But you promised. You said if I cooperated, my brother would be safe. You said it would only be questioning." And another pause. And then her voice broke, and she said, "He's my brother. He's all I have left." And I heard her start to cry, real sobbing that shook her whole body. And I stood there in that dark hallway, realizing that nothing was what I had thought it was, that the story I had constructed in my mind about my mother's betrayal was incomplete, that there were layers I hadn't understood. I crept back to my room without getting the water and lay in bed staring at the ceiling trying to process what I had just heard. She had done it to protect Uncle Mikhail, or at least she had been told she was protecting him. But protect him from what? What had they threatened her with? What leverage had? They used to make her turn over her own child. And why hadn't it worked? What happened that made her beg them on the phone 6 months later? The next morning I did something I had never done before. I went through my mother's things while she was at work. I searched her bedroom, her drawers, looking for anything that might explain what was happening. And in the back of her closet, hidden inside an old shoebox, I found letters, dozens of letters on official government stationery. The first one was dated almost a year before those men had come to our apartment, and it was from the Ministry of Education informing my mother that her brother Mikhail Volkov was under investigation for anti-Soviet activities and dissemination of Western propaganda, and that as his closest relative, she was required to report to a specific address for questioning. The second letter came a month later, this one more threatening, stating that failure to cooperate with state security services was itself a crime, punishable by imprisonment, and that her son, meaning me, might be removed from her care if she was deemed an unfit or politically unreliable parent. And then there was a third letter, and this one made my blood run cold. It outlined a proposal if she agreed to assist the state security services in monitoring her brother's activities, if she agreed to report on his associates and their conversations, and if she agreed to allow her son to be interviewed and potentially utilized as an additional source of information, then the state would show leniency. Her brother would not be arrested but merely watched. She would retain custody of her child, and both of them would be protected from the consequences of her brother's foolish political activities. I sat on her bedroom floor holding these letters and feeling the entire foundation of my understanding shift beneath me. She hadn't volunteered to betray us. She had been coerced, blackmailed, threatened with losing everything she loved. They had given her an impossible choice: sacrifice your son and brother to the KGB's machinery, or lose them both anyway, plus your freedom and possibly your life. And she had chosen what she thought was a lesser evil. She had believed their lies that cooperation would mean protection, that if she just gave them what they wanted, everyone would be safe. But of course the KGB's promises were worthless. They had used her cooperation to build their case. They had extracted information from both of us. And then they had arrested Uncle Mikhail anyway. I found out about his arrest not from my mother, but from a neighbor who mentioned it casually. "Did you hear about your uncle? Such a shame. They say he was plotting against the state, 5 years in a labor camp." And I had gone home and found my mother sitting at the kitchen table staring at nothing. And when I asked her if it was true, she just nodded. And I asked her why she didn't tell me. And she said, "What difference would it make? You can't change anything. No one can change anything." And I realized that she had given up, that whatever fight or hope she had once possessed was gone, crushed under the weight of a system that turned everyone into accomplices and then punished them anyway. But even knowing all this, even understanding that she had been trapped and manipulated and given impossible choices, I couldn't forgive her, because there's a difference between being forced to do something and doing it the way she did. She could have warned me, could have prepared me, could have at least looked me in the eye and said, "I'm sorry, but I have no choice." Instead, she had pretended everything was fine, had smiled and acted like those men at our door were there to help us, had pushed me toward them with that gentle, firm hand that said, "Trust me." And that betrayal of trust, that decision to lie to me even as she was handing me over, that was something I couldn't forgive. I started asking questions, carefully, quietly, trying to understand the full picture, without revealing how much I already knew. I talked to neighbors, to my uncle's friends who hadn't been arrested, to anyone who might have pieces of the puzzle, and slowly a story emerged that was so much darker and more complex than I had imagined. Uncle Mikhail had been part of a group of intellectuals who met regularly to discuss philosophy and politics. Nothing violent or revolutionary, just people talking about ideas, about the possibility of reform, about the books and music and art that were banned in the Soviet Union but thrived outside its borders. They weren't plotting terrorism or trying to overthrow the government. They were just thinking and talking. But in a totalitarian state, thinking is dangerous and talking is treason. The KGB had been watching this group for years, infiltrating it, documenting everything, and when they decided it was time to shut it down, they didn't just arrest everyone at once. No, that would be too simple, too clean. Instead, they went to the family members, to the wives and sisters and children, and they offered them deals. They turned families against each other, made everyone complicit, ensured that when the arrests finally came, no one would have clean hands. Everyone would share the guilt, and my mother had been just one of dozens of people they approached, and probably not even the first to agree. I learned that one of Uncle Mikhail's closest friends had been informed on by his own wife that another had been betrayed by a son who was barely older than me. We were all part of the same machine, all of us grinding each other down in the name of survival. And the system worked precisely because it distributed the guilt so widely that no one could claim innocence. But there was something else, something my mother never told me, and that I only discovered years later when the Soviet Union collapsed and some KGB files were opened. My mother hadn't just reported on my uncle to protect us. She had also been protecting herself, because when she was younger, before I was born, she had been involved with a man who later fled to the West, a dissident who had escaped during a cultural exchange program. And this connection, this old relationship that had ended decades ago, was in her file. It marked her as politically unreliable, as someone with questionable loyalties. And when they came to her about my uncle, they reminded her of this. They showed her documents about this old boyfriend. They implied that if she didn't cooperate, they would use this against her. They would say she was part of her brother's network, that she had been influenced by Western ideas, that she couldn't be trusted with the education of a Soviet child, meaning me. They had leverage upon leverage, threat upon threat, and she had crumbled under the pressure. And who could blame her? What choice did she really have? But here's what I couldn't reconcile. Even understanding all of this, even seeing the impossible position she was in, she still looked me in the eye and lied. She had still said, "Trust me," when she knew what was about to happen. She had still chosen to protect herself first and hoped that somehow I would survive the consequences. And maybe that's what parenthood looks like in a totalitarian state. Maybe love becomes a calculation of acceptable losses. Maybe you do what you must to survive, even if it means sacrificing your children's innocence, but it still felt like betrayal. It still felt like she had chosen wrong. Because what is the point of survival if you have to become someone unrecognizable to achieve it? What is the point of protecting your family if the price is destroying what makes you a family? I confronted her finally, one night about a year after Uncle Mikhail's arrest. I came home from school and found her at the kitchen table, and I put the letters in front of her, the ones from the ministry, the ones outlining their threats and promises. And I said, I know what they did to you. I know you didn't have a choice. And she looked at those letters and her face went white, and she asked me where I found them, and I said, does it matter? And we sat there in silence for a long time. And finally she spoke, and what she said wasn't an apology or an explanation, but a question. What would you have done? If you were in my position, what would you have chosen? And I wanted to say I would have fought. I would have refused. I would have found some way to protect everyone without betraying anyone. But I was 16 years old by then, and I had spent 3 years as an informant. 3 years reporting on my friends and teachers and neighbors. 3 years living with the knowledge that my information had contributed to arrests and ruined lives. And I knew that moral certainty was a luxury for people who had never been tested. That everyone likes to think they would be brave until a moment comes when bravery might cost them everything. So instead I said, I don't know. And she nodded like that was the answer she expected. And she said, neither did I. I just did what I thought would keep you safe. Keep us both safe. I believe their promises. I thought if I cooperated, we would be protected. And I was wrong. I was so wrong. And the terrible thing is I would probably make the same choice again because the alternative was losing you immediately with certainty rather than possibly keeping you with compromise. And I realized that this was the real truth I had been searching for, not that my mother was evil or even particularly weak, but that she was human, flawed and frightened, and trying to navigate an impossible system with imperfect information and no good options. She had made a calculation that sacrificing my innocence was better than sacrificing my life. That turning me into an informant was preferable to having me taken away or arrested or disappeared. And she had been wrong, or maybe she had been, right in ways I couldn't see. Maybe I was alive and relatively safe because of her choices. Maybe I would have suffered worse fates if she had refused. There was no way to know, no alternate timeline to compare against. Just a brutal reality that in a society built on fear and betrayal, everyone becomes both victim and perpetrator. Everyone makes compromises that corrode their souls. And the greatest crime isn't the individual choices people make under duress, but the system that forces them to make such choices in the first place. But understanding this didn't heal anything, didn't restore trust or rebuild our relationship. It just added another layer of sadness, another dimension of loss. Because now I couldn't even hate her cleanly, couldn't maintain the simple narrative that she was a villain who betrayed me. Instead, I had to live with the much more complicated and painful truth that she loved me and betrayed me, that she tried to protect me and destroyed me, that her actions were both unforgivable and understandable, and somehow that was worse than simple hatred, because it meant there was no resolution, no way to move forward, just this permanent state of broken connection, of love twisted into something unrecognizable, of a mother and son who survived but lost each other in the process. And the question that haunted me then, and haunts me still, is whether the KGB knew this would happen, whether they understood that by forcing families to betray each other, they weren't just gathering intelligence, but destroying the very fabric of human connection, creating a society where no one could trust anyone, where love itself became weaponized, where children grew up learning that safety required betrayal and survival demanded the death of innocence. And the answer I come to after all these years is yes. They knew exactly what they were doing. This was a side effect, but the goal, because a population that can't trust each other, that sees family members as potential informants, that learns to doubt their own feelings and question their own loyalties, that kind of population is easy to control, docile, manageable, too broken to resist. And my mother and I were just 2 more casualties in a war against human dignity that the Soviet system had been waging for decades. And the saddest part is that she never recovered from what she did. Even after the Soviet Union fell, even after the KGB was disbanded and the files were opened and people started talking about what had happened, she never forgave herself. She lived the rest of her life carrying that guilt, that knowledge that she had handed her son over to wolves, and no amount of understanding or context or explanation could ease that burden. And I never told her that I forgave her. because I did not really, or maybe I did, but in a way that was too complicated and conditional to put into words. And she died when I was 30, died still believing that I hated her. And maybe that was another kind of betrayal, my refusal to grant her absolution, my choice to let her suffer with her guilt rather than offer comfort I wasn't sure I felt. But then again, maybe that was just a final chapter in a story that began the day she handed me to the KGB. A story about how totalitarian systems don't just destroy individuals, but relationships. Don't just break bodies, but souls. Don't just steal freedom, but corrupt love itself until it becomes indistinguishable from its opposite. The escape from the KGB's grasp didn't come in a single dramatic moment like you see in movies. There was no daring midnight run across borders or shootout at a checkpoint. Instead, it came slowly, gradually, like ice melting in spring. So slowly you barely notice until suddenly the river is flowing again. It started in 1985 when Gorbachev came to power and began talking about glasnost and perestroika, openness and restructuring. Words that seem almost obscene after decades of rigid control. At first, nobody believed it. We had learned not to trust promises from above, had learned that any loosening of control was temporary, a trap designed to draw out dissidents, so they could be identified and crushed. But month by month, year by year, things began to change. Newspapers started publishing articles that would have been unthinkable before. People began speaking more openly, carefully at first, and then with growing boldness, and the KGB's grip, while still strong, began to show cracks. I was 20 years old in 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell. I watched on television in our small apartment. Images of people dancing on top of that barrier that had divided a city and symbolized the division of the entire world. And I watched my mother watching it, tears streaming down her face, and I couldn't tell if she was crying from joy or grief or some mixture of both. By then I had been an informant for 7 years. 7 years of reporting on classmates and professors and neighbors. 7 years of phone calls to handlers and secret meetings in parks and cafes. 7 years of living a double life that had become so normalized I sometimes forgot there had ever been another way to live. But as the Soviet system began to crumble, as the fear that had held everything together started to dissipate, I began to wonder if escape was possible. Not physical escape, but psychological escape. Freedom from the web of complicity and surveillance that had defined my entire adolescence. The final call came in late 1991, just months before the Soviet Union would officially dissolve. My handler, a man named Yuri who I had been reporting to for 3 years, contacted me and asked to meet at our usual place, a bench near Gorky Park. And when I arrived, he looked different, tired, defeated, like a man who knew his world was ending. He told me that the organization was being restructured, that many operations were being shut down, that my services were no longer required. He said it, clinically, professionally, as if we were discussing a job termination rather than the end of years of forced collaboration. And then he did something that shocked me. He apologized. He said, "I want you to know that none of this was personal. We were all serving the state, doing what we thought was necessary. But I realize now that we destroyed a lot of lives, a lot of futures. And for what? For a system that's collapsing anyway, for an ideology that couldn't sustain itself, I'm sorry for what we took from you." And I sat there on that bench looking at this man who had controlled a significant portion of my life for 3 years, who had the power to threaten and coerce and destroy. And I realized he was just another broken person, another victim of the same system that had victimized me. And I didn't feel anger or satisfaction or even relief. I just felt empty. I asked him what would happen to the files, to all the information I had provided over the years, all the names and conversations and betrayals. And he shrugged and said some of it will be destroyed, some will be archived, some will probably be leaked or sold. There's no control of it anymore. Everything is chaos. And I thought about all the people I had informed on, all the lives I had potentially damaged, and I wondered if they would ever know, if my name would appear in some open file someday, if they would discover that the quiet boy they had trusted was reporting their words to the secret police. Yuri stood up to leave, and I asked him one more question. Was any of it worth it? Did we actually stop anything, prevent anything, protect anything? And he looked at me with eyes that had seen too much and said, "No, we just made people afraid. And fear doesn't protect anything. It just destroys slowly instead of quickly." And then he walked away, and I never saw him again. Going home that day, I felt like I was walking through a city I didn't recognize. Moscow looked the same, but everything had changed, or maybe I had changed and was finally seeing clearly. I thought about my Uncle Mikhail who had been released from the labor camp 2 years earlier, broken in body and spirit, an old man at 45. He had come back to Moscow and tried to rebuild his life, but he was never the same. The light that had made him passionate about ideas and truth and justice had been extinguished, replaced by a dull cautiousness, a reluctance to express any opinion that might be deemed controversial. We had seen each other a few times, and it was awkward and painful. He knew I had informed on him, though we never discussed it explicitly, and I knew he had suffered because of information I provided, and we tried to maintain some relationship because we were family, but it was hollow, performative, two damaged people going through motions of connection. While carefully avoiding anything real, I decided that night that I needed to leave Moscow, leave Russia entirely if possible, not because I was in danger anymore, but because I couldn't breathe in a place where every street corner held memories of betrayal, where every conversation was shadowed by years of paranoia and complicity. I started making plans, applying for documents, exploring opportunities abroad. And in 1993, 2 years after the Soviet Union's collapse, I moved to Germany initially, then eventually to Canada, putting oceans and continents between myself and the person I had been. But of course you can't outrun your past. You carry it with you like a second skeleton beneath your skin. I tried to build a new life, went to university, learned new languages, made friends who knew nothing about where I came from or what I'd done. And for a while I thought maybe I could simply become someone else. Erase the informant and the betrayed son and the broken boy and replace it with a functional adult who had normal relationships and didn't wake up at 3 a.m. drowning in guilt. But trauma doesn't work. That way, it doesn't stay buried no matter how deep you dig the hole. I found myself unable to form close relationships because intimacy required trust, and I had learned that trust was a weapon. I sabotaged friendships when they got too deep, pushed away romantic partners when they asked too many questions about my past. I lived in a constant state of low-level anxiety, always looking over my shoulder, even though no one was following me, always carefully monitoring my words, even though no one was listening. The psychological conditioning of those years as an informant had carved grooves in my brain that I couldn't smooth out. Therapy helped. Eventually, years of it, sitting in comfortable offices with patient professionals who taught me vocabulary for what I had experienced. Words like trauma and complex PTSD and moral injury. They helped me understand that what had been done to me wasn't my fault, that I was a child in an impossible situation. That cooperation under duress isn't the same as willing collaboration, but understanding something intellectually and feeling it emotionally are different things. And part of me will always be that 13-year-old boy watching his mother step aside to let the KGB take him. Always that teenager making phone calls to handlers and reporting on people he cared about. Always complicit. Always guilty. Always stained. My mother died in 2003. She never left Russia. Never adapted well to the post-Soviet world. She had lived her entire life within a certain system, and when that system collapsed, she seemed lost, unmoored. I had maintained minimal contact with her. Over the years, brief phone calls on holidays, the occasional letter, but I never went back to visit. Couldn't bring myself to sit across from her in that apartment, where so much had been destroyed. When I got the call that she had died, heart attack, quick and relatively painless, my first emotion was relief, and my second was crushing guilt about feeling relief. I flew back for the funeral, my first time in Moscow in a decade, and the city was both familiar and alien, shiny new buildings next to crumbling Soviet-era blocks, Western brands everywhere, young people who had grown up in a different country than the one I had known. At the funeral, there were maybe a dozen people, mostly her co-workers and a few old neighbors. Uncle Mikhail was there, even older and more fragile than I remembered. And when he saw me, he embraced me and started crying. And he whispered, "I forgive you, I forgive you." And I realized he thought I needed his forgiveness, when really what I needed was to forgive myself. We sat together after the service and talked for the first time, really talked in over a decade. And he told me that he understood why I had done what I did, that he had never blamed me, that I was a child and what choice did I have. And I told him about finding the letters, about learning that my mother had been coerced and threatened, about understanding that we were all victims of a system designed to turn us against each other. And he nodded and said, yes, that's exactly what was. They were experts at it, at finding the pressure points, at making us betray each other, and then live with the guilt forever. Their greatest trick wasn't surveillance or the arrests or even the labor camps. It was convincing us to destroy ourselves and each other so thoroughly that we'd never recover. And I asked him if he had recovered, and he laughed bitterly and said, "Do any of us recover? We just learn to live with the damage. And maybe that's as close to recovery as we get." I went through my mother's apartment after the funeral, sorting through her belongings, deciding what to keep and what to throw away. And in her bedroom, in that same closet where I'd found the letters years ago, I found something else, a journal, dozens of notebooks, actually dating back to before I was born and continuing almost until her death. I sat on her bedroom floor and read them, page after page of her thoughts and fears and regrets. And what I found there broke my heart in new ways. She had documented everything. Her initial contact with the KGB, her terror when they threatened to take me away, her desperate hope that cooperation would protect us both, her growing horror as she realized they had lied to her, that her brother would be arrested regardless, that her son had been corrupted for nothing, and then pages and pages about her guilt, about watching me become withdrawn and cold, about knowing she had destroyed our relationship but not knowing how to fix it. She wrote about wanting to explain, wanting to apologize, but being paralyzed by shame and fear that any attempt at reconciliation would only make things worse. She wrote about the day I left Russia, about standing at the window watching the street below, even though she couldn't see me, couldn't see the taxi that took me to the airport, just watching because she didn't know what else to do. And she wrote, "I've lost him. I saved his life but lost his soul. And I don't know which would have been worse, losing him to the KGB or losing him like this, to silence and distance and a hurt too deep for any bridge to cross." I sat there surrounded by her notebooks and cried for the first time since I was 13. Cried for her and for me and for Uncle Mikhail and for everyone who had been caught in that machine, for all the families destroyed, all the relationships corrupted, all the love twisted into weapons. And I understood finally that there were no villains in our story, or rather we were all villains, and all victims simultaneously, trapped in a system that required betrayal for survival, and then punished us with guilt for surviving. I kept the journals, brought them back to Canada with me, and sometimes I read them when I need to remember that my mother was a human being, flawed and frightened, and doing her best in circumstances that had no good options. It doesn't erase what happened, doesn't heal the wounds or restore what was lost, but it adds context, adds dimension, transforms her from the simple figure, the betraying mother, into a complex, tragic person who loved me and failed me in ways she couldn't prevent. I'm 53 years old now. It's been 40 years since that afternoon when KGB agents came to our apartment. For decades since my mother handed me over, and everything changed. I have a life in Canada, work as a translator, have a few close friends who know my story. I never married, never had children. Couldn't bring myself to risk recreating the parent-child bond that had been so catastrophically broken. Sometimes people ask if I've forgiven my mother, and I tell them it's the wrong question. Forgiveness implies a clear moral accounting, a definable wrong that could be absolved. But what happened to us was more complicated than that. She made choices that hurt me profoundly, choices I wish she hadn't made. But she made them from a place of fear and love, impossible constraint. So instead of forgiveness, I've tried to cultivate something else, understanding maybe, or acceptance, or simply acknowledgement that we were both casualties of forces larger than ourselves. I think about her often, especially on the anniversary of her death, and I wonder what our relationship might have been if we had lived in a different place, a different time, a different system. If she could have been just a mother, and I could have been just a son, without the KGB and the fear and the forced betrayals. Would we have been close? Would we have loved each other openly and easily? Would I have memories of warmth instead of this vast, complicated sadness? I'll never know. Those alternate possibilities died in 1982 along with my childhood innocence. But here's what I've learned in the decades since. Totalitarian systems don't just imprison bodies. They imprison souls. They don't just control behavior. They corrupt the fundamental human capacities for trust and love and connection, and the damage they do persists long after the systems themselves collapse. I am free now, have been free for over 30 years, but part of me will always be that 13-year-old boy being led away from his mother. Part of me will always be the informant making phone calls to handlers. Part of me will always carry the weight of all the small betrayals that became my normal, and I think my mother carried similar weight until the day she died. We were both imprisoned by what happened, both serving life sentences in prisons of memory and guilt and fractured identity, and maybe that's the real story I'm telling you today. Not just a story of one mother's betrayal and one son's corruption, but the story of how authoritarian power works, how it doesn't just rule through force, but through complicity, how it turns everyone into collaborators and then ensures that the guilt of collaboration destroys us more thoroughly than any prison ever could. If you take anything from my story, let it be this: freedom isn't just about elections and markets and the absence of secret police. It's about preserving the spaces where trust can exist, where families can love each other without fear, where children can grow up without being weaponized, where difficult moral choices don't require the sacrifice of human dignity. My mother said I was safe, and then she handed me to the KGB. And in doing so, she taught me the most important and terrible lesson of my life, that safety purchased through betrayal isn't safety at all. It's just a slower form of destruction, and the only real safety, the only real freedom, comes from building societies where parents never have to make such choices, where love doesn't have to be compromised for survival, where the bonds between human beings are sacred and protected rather than exploited and destroyed. I don't know if such societies exist, if such perfect freedom is even possible, but I know that my mother and I and millions like us paid the price for its absence, and if telling our story helps even one person understand what's at stake, helps preserve or build systems that protect rather than corrupt human connection, then maybe, just maybe, some meaning can be salvaged from all that was lost. That's what I choose to believe anyway. It's the only way I found to live with what happened, to transform the pain into purpose and the damage into a warning. And some days that's enough. Some days I can look at my reflection and see not just the informant or the betrayed son, but survivor, a witness, someone who lived through darkness and came out the other side, scarred but whole enough to speak. To remember, to ensure that the dead and the damaged and the destroyed are not forgotten. And on those days, I can almost forgive my mother, can almost forgive myself, can almost believe that the long path from that afternoon in 1982 to this moment now has led somewhere worth arriving, has taught lessons worth learning, has preserved something worth preserving, and maybe that's as close to redemption as any of us get.